And if the books that shaped your faith wasn't the only ones, and if the most transforming texts of human spirituality, they had been buried, not by the dust of time, but by human hands with power and fear. Have you ever wondered why the Bible has exactly 66 books and not 70, 80, or 100? Who decided that? Who had the power to declare what was divine and what should be forgotten forever? Imagine a secret library hidden under the rubble of history, where texts that speak of a meditating Christ, of a fated female wisdom, of a God who is light, not dogma, rest. Texts that challenge the power structure that we today call religion, and that were why they were silenced. This video is not an attack on your faith. It is an invitation to dive into questions that few have the courage to ask, because maybe the greatest heresy is not in the prohibited texts, but in the silence imposed on them. But beware, every minute of this video opens doors that you may never be able to close again. Are you ready? Long before there was an official Bible, there was chaos, but not a destructive chaos. It was creative, fertile chaos, full of possibilities. At the beginning of the Christian era, hundreds of communities spread throughout the Middle East. Africa and Europe lived their faith in very different ways from each other, and they all had something in common: texts, many texts. There were gospels that spoke of a smiled Jesus, who walked among the masters of the desert, who taught in enigmatic parables over the inner kingdom. There were letters written by women, views received in caves, revelations that did not go through altars, but by hearts in ecstasy. All this was sacred. All of this was transmitted. All of this was lived. There was no New Testament. There was no closed collection. There were manuscripts rolling from hand to hand, careful copies, and faith. Some communities were guided by Peter's gospel, others by Tome. Still others read the Shepherd of Hermas or the Apocalypse of Elijah as a living word. It was a faith in construction, shaped by multiple voices and not by one. But the more the message spread, but she drew attention, and attention in the Roman Empire was a danger. When Christianity ceased to be a persecuted religion and came to approach political power, the need for control imposed itself. An empire cannot support itself on multiple interpretations. He needs one truth, one rule, one book. It was when the most silent process began, and perhaps the most lethal in the history of faith, that of spiritual uniformity. Suddenly, what was once a colorful tapestry of mystical experiences began to be seen as a threat to stability. Plurality became confusion, and the confusion needed to be cut by the dogma blade. But none of this happened at once, nor with a single decree. Gradually, texts were being discarded. First, subtly, just left aside. Then, hard, forbidden, burned, forgotten. And the most curious, many of those who rejected them, they had never read them completely. And so, chapter by chapter, page by page, a new Christianity began to be born. No more Christianity of diversity, but that of official doctrine. And that's right, that the names and decisions that shaped what we call sacred books begin to emerge. At some point, someone had to choose. Not what was true, but what would be allowed as truth. And that someone was not an angel, not a prophet. They were bishops, theologians, emperors, men. History records that in the 367 after Christ, a bishop named Athanasius of Alexandria wrote an Easter letter to his communities. In it, it listed the 27 books that, according to him, should be read in the churches. It was not yet an imperial decree, but it was a suggestion that came from a figure with increasing authority within the church. It was the first time it has been in writing exactly the list we call New Testament today. And make no mistake, many books were left out. And not because they were false, but because they did not align themselves with the dominant theology. This theology was beginning to consolidate itself as an instrument of political unity, and not just spiritual. Shortly thereafter, the Laodicea, Hippo, and Carthage councils would confirm this list, turning a proposal into dogma, a symbolic closure of the canon, What was inside was sacred. What was out, it became heresy. But heresy according to who? The Gospel of Thomas, for example, was widely read among Egyptian Christians. Already the Gospel of Mary circulated among mystical groups that saw the feminine as a legitimate expression of the divine. Peter's Apocalypse spoke of a more symbolic than punitive hell, a metaphor for the awakening of consciousness and not to eternal terror. They were texts that inspired, healed, released. But freedom did not match empire. The new faith needed delimited borders. He needed a God who commanded, or to dialogue. I needed men in charge, and women in silence. Thus, what did not serve the new model was excluded, not with spiritual arguments, but with administrative decisions. And a new structure of spiritual power began to rise, made of doctrinal walls, and doors locked with authority padlocks. It is easy to think that this process was transparent, open, based on divine revelations. But the truth, raw, uncomfortable, and inevitable, is that the canon was a human construction. And where there are humans, there are choices, interests, and omissions. And it was precisely these omissions that left tracks scattered all over the story. Fragments, echoes, remnants of a faith that could have been. But it was interrupted. Interestingly, which was erased, left traces. As invisible footprints that only appear under a certain light, the forgotten texts began to reappear at unlikely times, as if the time itself refused to be an accomplice of silence. The most emblematic example came in 1945 in an Egyptian village named Nag Hammadi. A peasant, digging in search of fertilizer, found a jar of buried clay. Inside, there were 13 codices of papyrus, with more than 50 ancient Christian texts, almost all considered heretical by the 4th century councils. Among them, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Truth, and the Egyptian Gospel. Texts that did not speak of original sin, nor flaming hells, but self-knowledge, awakening of consciousness, mystical union with the divine. In Thomas, for example, Jesus says, "The kingdom of God is within you and around you." It is a spirituality that invites introspection, and not submission. But that was not an isolated case. 2 years later, in 1947, Bedouin shepherds accidentally discovered the Dead Sea manuscripts, hidden in caves near Qumran. More than 900 texts between whole rolls and fragments, revealing spiritual practices, alternative messianic views in a community that lived on the fringes of official Judaism. Some scholars believe this sect, the Essenes, may have directly influenced the teachings of John the Baptist, and even Jesus. And the most intriguing, in many of these texts, there are symbols and concepts that echo much older traditions. Light as a divine source, the serpent as wisdom, the feminine as a channel of the sacred, silence as revelation. Elements that were systematically swept from posterior Christianity, but still live between the lines of these manuscripts. And not just the text, Some practices disappeared with them. Fasting as a way to clean the mind, not just the body. Silent meditation as prayer. The use of oils and herbs in spiritual healing rituals. The search for internal revelations without the need for temples. A Christianity that looked more like a mystery school than an institution. These traces challenge the idea that from the beginning there was a pure doctrine. They show that there were many ways to live faith, and that the path chosen as official, it was just one of many. And perhaps, looking at these fragments, start an uncomfortable but inevitable question. What else was lost? Or rather, what else was erased on purpose? If there is something more dangerous than a lie, it is a half-truth told as if it were the whole. And that is exactly what shaped the structure of faith as we know today. A series of editorial choices, disguised as divine revelation. Make no mistake, books that did not enter the Bible were not simply ignored. Many were systematically erased. In some cases, literally burned in public squares. In others, disfigured through subtle rewrites over the centuries. What survived? Survived despite this. The Gospel of Mary, for example, disappeared almost completely. Only fragments resisted. And in these fragments, Mary Magdalene does not appear as a prostitute, but as the closest disciple to Jesus, one who understands what others do not understand, who speaks with authority, that teaches. This was unthinkable for an ecclesiastical structure and formation, where the sacred needed to have a male face. Similarly, Peter's Apocalypse, which described a symbolic hell, where suffering was part of the awakening of the soul, ought an eternal punishment, was rejected by bringing too compassionate view to the interests of spiritual control. After all, a literal hell was an excellent instrument of coercion. Even canonical texts did not escape. The end of the Gospel of Mark, as it is today in many Bibles, does not appear in the oldest manuscripts. It was later added, perhaps by editors concerned about a weak closure, or with an uncomfortable absence of physical resurrection. The message needed to be more blunt, more orthodox, more useful. The copyist monks, throughout the Middle Ages, had the power to decide what would be reproduced. And like every human power, this was also selectively used. Many works were not copied. Others were subtly modified. Even the name of God was being changed, translated, diluted. And what was mystical and deep was becoming institutional, rigid, and predictable. The transformations also reached symbols. The serpent, which in ancient traditions represented wisdom, regeneration, and vital energy, was transformed into an evil symbol. The feminine, once linked to intuition, spiritual pregnancy, and divine presence, was reduced to temptation. Even silence, so valued in mystical traditions, has become suspicious in favor of noisy, public, controlled rituals. None of this was by chance. It was construction, deliberate, slow, and deeply effective. And perhaps realizing this movement, a new restlessness arises. Not just about what was taken from the books, but about what was taken from within us. When we start pages from a book, the story does not disappear. She just is incomplete. And that is exactly what happened to modern spirituality. It carries the echoes of something larger, but mutilated. What is left, though valuable, is a map with blank areas. A path where certain milestones were removed, certain symbols were reversed, and certain truths silenced. And the result is that for many, faith today seems hard, limited, repetitive. But has she always been like this? Many people abandon religion not because they reject God, but for not recognizing themselves in the ways he was presented. Perhaps because the God who sought was light and silence, and what they offered to them was crying and guilt. Perhaps because they expected to find a master who would help them awaken, and found institutions that taught them to obey. The erasure of texts that spoke of the divine inner, the sacred feminine, of salvation by knowledge, was not just a literary exclusion. It was an amputation of the collective soul. And this emptiness still pulsates. Christianity could have been, and perhaps it may still be, a journey of reconnection with the mystery. It could have been a call to inner awakening, deep meditation, compassionate love, and union with God without intermediaries. But when the canon was closed, the field of possibilities was also closed. And this is not just a theological problem. It is existential. Because where symbols are missing, dogmas arise. Where inner wisdom is lacking, dependence on external authorities grows. And where spiritual diversity lacks, fanaticism is born. But the good news is that the forgotten text did not die. They wait. Sometimes in dusty manuscripts hidden in caves. Other times in small phrases that escape censorship. And almost always in the heart of those who dare to ask, is that all? Because when someone today feels that there is something missing in their faith, perhaps it is not losing faith. Perhaps it is, for the first time, approaching its most authentic source. And if the sacred books are not just what is printed on a golden cover, but also what pulsates in silence, forgotten, forbidden. And if, among the erased texts, it is not just another point of view, but the missing key for you to understand what you always felt, but never knew how to explain. The books that didn't let us read speak. They speak among the lines that resisted. They speak through the questions that do not want us to ask. They speak through the discomfort we feel when we realize that our faith may have been shaped more for human structures than for divine revelations, but they are still there. In the silent monasteries' files, in the broken vessels of the desert, and especially in your right to seek. This video does not end with an answer, because some answers do not fit in words. They only fit in hours. And maybe yours started today, when you chose to listen what the story tried to silence. In the next few episodes, let's dive even deeper in the Gospels that speak of a forgotten Christ, in hidden symbols that survive censorship, and in the mysteries that challenge everything you thought you knew. Because sometimes the true sacred, this is precisely what they forbade you to know.